son-in-law handed my daughter a list of things she was no longer allowed to discuss with me. I found out because she accidentally left it open on her laptop when I was visiting, and I read 3 lines before I understood what I was looking at. My name is Ray Callister. I'm 58 years old. I spent 26 years working as a structural inspector for Maricopa County in Arizona, checking bridges and overpasses and retaining walls, making sure the things people drive over every day without thinking about them are actually going to hold. I retired early when my wife Carol got sick. She passed 3 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 14 months from the first scan to the end. She was the kind of woman who kept a running list of everyone she owed a phone call to, who sent handwritten notes when people had surgeries or lost jobs, who remembered the names of my coworkers' kids and asked about them by name at the Christmas party every year. She loved our daughter fiercely. She would have known something was wrong long before I did. I should have known sooner too. Our daughter. I'll call her my daughter because that's what she is. Before she had a name anyone else gave her, married her husband 6 years ago in a small outdoor ceremony in Sedona. His name is Bryce. He was 34 at the time, worked in commercial real estate, owned his own car, paid his own rent, said all the right things. I shook his hand at the rehearsal dinner and thought, this man loves my daughter. I was not wrong about that exactly. What I missed was the other part, the part where love for Bryce also meant ownership. It started before Carol died. Small things. My daughter would call me on a Tuesday and we'd talk for 40 minutes the way we always had, about nothing in particular. About her job at the dental office, about the neighborhood, about what she was reading. And then the calls got shorter. Not by a lot, not at first. 25 minutes. 15. I told myself she was busy. They had just bought a house in Gilbert. She was tired. Bryce traveled for work and she was managing things on her own a lot of the time. I gave her space. When Carol died, my daughter drove down from Gilbert and stayed with me for 4 days. She slept in her old room. We sat on the back porch and drank coffee in the mornings and didn't always talk. Sometimes we just sat there. That was enough. Bryce came the second day, stayed one night, and drove back to Gilbert in the morning because he had a meeting. I said I understood. I did not fully understand, but I said it. After the funeral, I settled into the silence of the house. I had retired to take care of Carol, and suddenly there was nothing to take care of. I started calling my daughter more. Not obsessively. Sunday evenings, sometimes Wednesday afternoons when I knew she had a half day at the office. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. She was all I had left of the family we used to be. Bryce had a different view of that. The changes were gradual enough that I almost didn't notice them as a pattern. My daughter started texting instead of calling. Then the texts got shorter. One time I called on a Sunday and she picked up, but I could hear Bryce's voice somewhere in the background and she said she'd call me back and didn't. I called again 2 days later. She apologized, said things had been hectic. I said, of course, no problem. Because I was the kind of person who said that. Carol used to say I was too easy, that I swallowed things I should have said out loud, and she was right. She was almost always right about that kind of thing. About 8 months after Carol passed, I drove up to Gilbert to take my daughter to lunch for her birthday. Just the two of us, the way we'd done every year since she turned 16. Bryce was working from home that day. When I arrived, he came to the door before she did, and he was pleasant enough. He's always pleasant. That's the thing about Bryce. He never raises his voice, never says anything overtly cruel, just rearranges the air around you until breathing takes more effort than it should. He said he hoped I wasn't planning to be too long, that they had plans that evening. It was 11 in the morning. I said, of course not, just a birthday lunch. He smiled and called her name. She came to the door with her coat already on, like she'd been waiting just inside. We ate at a place she liked, a Mexican restaurant on Val Vista Drive with good salsa and paper placemats, and she was lovely and warm, and laughed at my terrible joke about the bridge inspection I'd done the week before my retirement, the one where the drainage pipe had been installed pointing directly into the road instead of away from it, a 20-year oversight nobody caught. She laughed the way she always laughed, with her whole face, and then her phone buzzed on the table and she glanced at it, and something shifted, just slightly in her shoulders. She turned the phone face down. We finished lunch. She hugged me in the parking lot and said she'd call soon. She didn't call for 11 days. I noticed that because I kept track. Not because I was monitoring her. Not because I'm that kind of father. I noticed because it had never happened before. In 32 years of her life, my daughter had never gone 11 days without calling me. Even when she was studying abroad in college, even when she was swamped with exams or traveling. We had always found a few minutes. When she finally called, she sounded fine. Normal. A little tired, she said, but fine. I didn't mention the 11 days. I'm not sure why I didn't. Maybe I already knew, somewhere underneath where I was looking, that the 11 days wasn't an accident. The moment I understood what was happening came about 6 months later, on a Thursday afternoon when I drove up to visit without a specific plan. I know. I should have called ahead. I usually did. But I had a doctor's appointment in Chandler that got canceled. I was already 40 minutes up the 60, and I thought I'd surprise her. Bring pastries from the Portuguese place near her office that she'd mentioned loving. The kind of small, spontaneous thing that had always been fine between us. Bryce answered the door. He didn't let me in immediately. He stood in the doorway, and he was pleasant. He smiled, and he said this wasn't actually a great time, that my daughter was dealing with some work stress and needed some quiet. I asked if I could just say hello. He said he'd tell her I stopped by. I left the pastry box on the porch and drove 40 minutes home. She called that evening. She sounded strange. Not upset? Not quite. More like someone reading off a card held just out of frame. She said I really should call ahead next time. She said Bryce didn't like surprises. I said I understood. I did not say what I was actually thinking, which was that I had known this woman her entire life and had never needed an appointment to love her. About 2 months after that, I found the list. I was visiting. Scheduled visit. I had called 3 days ahead. I was sitting at their kitchen table while she made coffee. She'd left her laptop open on the counter, just a foot from where I was sitting, and the document was on the screen. I wasn't trying to read it. I'm not that person, but it was right there, and the formatting was unmistakable, a bullet-pointed list, and the first 3 points I read before I looked away were no discussing finances with your father, no sharing information about health matters, no inviting your father to events without prior approval from Bryce. I looked away. I looked at my hands on the table. I looked at the coffee maker, which was finishing its cycle and beginning to smell the way coffee smells in my daughter's kitchen, which smells like Carol's kitchen used to smell, which I don't know how to explain to anyone who hasn't lost someone. She brought the cups to the table. She sat down across from me. She talked about her garden, the tomatoes she was trying to grow, the fact that one of her colleagues was leaving the practice. I talked back. I don't know what I said. I was still sitting with what I'd seen. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table for a long time. I want to be clear about something. My son-in-law had never hit my daughter. Had never, as far as I knew, threatened her. He didn't drink, didn't gamble, paid his bills on time, kept the yard clean. By every external measure, he was a perfectly adequate husband. But there is a kind of damage that doesn't leave marks you can photograph, and what I had just read on that laptop was a list of instructions for how my daughter was supposed to manage the one relationship in her life that predated him, and it had her compliance. That was the part I kept coming back to. She hadn't pushed back. Or maybe she had, and it hadn't mattered, and she had stopped. I didn't say anything to her that visit. I drove home. I sat. And I started paying attention differently. I'm a structural inspector by training and by temperament. I don't panic. I look at a thing from multiple angles, I note what I see, I document it, I assess load-bearing capacity. I started doing that. I started writing things down. Every canceled visit, every call that ended abruptly, every time she said she'd call me back and didn't, every event I wasn't invited to. Her office holiday party, which I'd attended every year for a decade. A neighborhood barbecue she mentioned in passing and then backtracked on, saying it was just casual, probably boring. I wrote them down with dates. What I also did, about 3 weeks after finding the list, was call a woman named Beverly Cho. Beverly is a family law attorney in Scottsdale. My coworker Dennis had mentioned her 2 years earlier when he was going through a difficult custody situation after his brother's divorce. I had never thought I would need a family law attorney in my own life. I had her number because Dennis had written it on a post-it note that I'd stuck inside the back cover of my address book. The old paper kind, Carol bought it for me in 2004, and I still use it. Beverly was patient and precise. I told her what I'd seen, what I'd noticed, what I'd written down. She listened without interrupting, and when I was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Callister, what you're describing has a name. It's called coercive control. It doesn't require physical violence. It's a pattern of behavior designed to isolate a partner from their support network and establish dominance over their decisions." She said it calmly, the way a doctor explains a diagnosis. Not to frighten you, but to name the thing clearly so you can figure out what to do with it. She told me I couldn't force my daughter to do anything. My daughter was an adult making her own choices, even if those choices were being shaped by someone else's pressure. What I could do was make sure I was still there. Visible. Present. Not in a way that created more conflict for her, but in a way that kept a thread alive. Beverly also told me something I hadn't known. In Arizona, grandparent visitation rights generally apply once grandchildren are involved, but there are also legal avenues related to elder financial exploitation and protective orders when a pattern of isolation is documented. She told me to keep documenting. Here's the thing I hadn't told Beverly yet, the thing that came out in our second conversation 3 weeks later. About 14 months after Carol died, I had given my daughter and Bryce $45,000. It was money from the sale of Carol's car and some investments Carol had in her name that came to me after the estate settled. I had meant it as a contribution toward the renovation they were planning, a new kitchen and bathroom in the Gilbert house. I had not attached conditions to it because it did not occur to me to attach conditions to it. It was family money. They were family. I had given it without documentation because that is what you do when you trust people. Beverly asked me to describe the transfer. I described it, a cashier's check, written out to Bryce because he was managing the renovation finances. Made out in his name alone, not my daughter's. I had thought nothing of it at the time. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want you to call your accountant and ask them to pull records of that transfer, and I want you to ask your daughter as casually as you can how the kitchen renovation is coming along." The kitchen hadn't been renovated. I asked, the following Sunday, in the most offhand way I could manage. "Oh," she said. They'd decided to hold off. The contractor they'd been working with had some issues. Maybe next year. My accountant is a man named Wendell Okafor. He's been doing my taxes since I was still at the county. He's meticulous in a way that borders on obsessive, and I mean that as a compliment. I asked Wendell to pull everything related to that transfer. Wendell, being Wendell, had kept copies of the cashier's check and the letter I'd written to accompany it, which I'd forgotten I had written. The letter said, "For the kitchen and bathroom renovation, with love." He also found something I had not known to look for. Using bank records I was able to obtain through my own accounts. I had a joint savings account with my daughter that we'd maintained since she was in college, a holdover we'd never closed, which Carol had suggested keeping for emergencies. Wendell found that $45,000 had cleared through Bryce's account within 3 weeks of the transfer and had not gone to any contractor. It had gone into a real estate investment account in Bryce's name only. A commercial property deal in Peoria he'd been trying to put together for over a year. My daughter's money, my wife's money, Carol's savings and her car and the last of what she'd built had gone into Bryce's business venture without my daughter apparently knowing. I sat in Wendell's office for a long time after he showed me the paper trail. I thought about Bryce in the doorway of the Gilbert house, pleasant, smiling, telling me this wasn't a great time. I thought about my daughter with her code already on at 11 in the morning on her birthday. I thought about Carol, who had not trusted Bryce from the beginning, but had never said so directly, who had said to me once, carefully, "I hope she has someone she can call, Ray. Just make sure she always has someone she can call." I had been that person. Bryce had been working, quietly and consistently, to make sure she didn't. Beverly and Wendell worked together over the following 8 weeks. I did not contact Bryce. I did not tip my hand. I kept calling ahead for visits. I showed up when I was supposed to, left when I was expected to, said nothing about any of it. I sat in their living room and talked about my tomato plants and asked my daughter about her colleagues at the dental office. I was, I think, the calmest I have ever been in my life, and I have spent my career being calm in situations where calm was the thing most needed. What Beverly prepared was a formal letter to Bryce. It documented the $45,000 transfer, the stated purpose of the funds in my accompanying letter, the evidence that the funds had been redirected without my daughter's knowledge, and formal notice that I was treating the transfer as a loan, which under Arizona law, given the documented misuse of the funds, I had grounds to do with a request for repayment within 60 days. The letter also noted, in language that was clear and not inflammatory, that I had documented a pattern of behavior consistent with financial exploitation and coercive isolation, and that I was prepared to proceed further if the behavior continued. Wendell prepared a financial summary, clean, dated, specific. Every transaction, the cashier's check, the letter, the transfer out of Bryce's account into the investment vehicle in Peoria, the fact that no kitchen had been renovated. I put both documents in a brown envelope. I called my daughter and asked if I could come by that Saturday. She said yes. I drove to Gilbert with the envelope on the passenger seat. She answered the door. She looked surprised to see me there without Bryce. He was inside somewhere. I could hear the television. She let me in, asked if I wanted coffee. I said I had something for her. I asked her to sit down. She looked at my face and something shifted in her expression. She sat. I put the envelope on the kitchen table. I sat down across from her. I said, I need you to read this. I need you to know that whatever happens next, I am not angry. I am not here to make anything harder for you. But I found something, and you deserve to know what it is, and I should have found a way to tell you sooner. She looked at the envelope for a long moment. She picked it up. She opened it. She read for a long time. I watched her face the way you watch a sky when you know weather is coming, not the face of someone discovering something small. The face of someone for whom a thing that had been half understood, vaguely felt, not quite real, suddenly is, all of it at once, too much to process in the right order. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything at first. Then she said, Dad. Just that. Dad. I said, I know. Bryce appeared in the kitchen doorway then. He saw the envelope, saw her face, and his expression, the pleasant, managed one, flickered. Something underneath came briefly to the surface. He said, What's going on? She looked at him. She looked at the documents on the table, and she said in a voice I had not heard from her in years, a voice that sounded like the person she had been before I started having to schedule time with her. Where did the money go, Bryce? He tried. He tried the explanation that it was for both of them, that the investment would pay off and they'd do the kitchen after. That she'd been involved in the decision. She let him talk. She was very still in the way that people are still, when they are finished arguing and are only waiting for themselves to catch up to a conclusion they've already reached. I stayed for an hour. I did not escalate. I did not raise my voice. I did not have to. The document said everything that needed saying, and Beverly's letter did the rest. My daughter called Beverly herself 2 days later, not as an adversary. As someone who needed to understand what her options were. There were a lot of conversations after that, many of which I was part of and many of which I wasn't. I'm not going to tell my daughter's story for her. That belongs to her. What I can tell you is that 8 months later, she was separated from Bryce, living in a rental in Tempe, that she'd found herself and signed herself and furnished herself. The first place that had been entirely hers in 6 years. The $45,000 was addressed as part of the separation agreement, some of it recovered from the investment account, which had not gone as well as Bryce had projected, and some of it written off. Beverly advised me that pursuing the remainder wasn't worth the cost. I agreed. Some losses are just losses. What I want you to understand, if you are watching this and recognizing something you've been trying not to name, is that what I went through has a name. It's called coercive control, and financial exploitation is one of the most common tools inside it. It doesn't always look like cruelty. Sometimes it looks like a man who keeps the yard clean and pays his bills on time and smiles pleasantly in doorways. Sometimes it looks like a list of rules on a laptop screen that you weren't supposed to see. The person on the receiving end, if there's someone who trusts the people they love, who doesn't want to make trouble, who's been slowly taught that their instincts are wrong and their relationships are inconvenient, that person will absorb a great deal before they understand what's being done to them. I'm not a confrontational man. I spent my career reading structure. I look at the load-bearing elements. I find the places where stress has been applied unevenly. And I document what I see, because documentation is the thing that holds when everything else gets argued about. If you gave money to a family member and you didn't document it, go talk to an accountant. Not because you don't trust them, because documentation protects everyone, including you, including them, if things ever change in ways you didn't anticipate. A simple letter stating the amount, the purpose, and whether it was a gift or a loan can be the difference between having recourse and having nothing. I learned that the hard way. And if you are watching someone being isolated, a parent being kept at a distance, a sibling who suddenly doesn't call anymore, a friend whose life is becoming smaller and more managed and more supervised, say something, not in a way that creates a bigger conflict for them, but say something. Because the person inside it often cannot see the shape of what's happening from where they're standing. They're too close. They're too tired. They've been told too many times that their instincts are wrong. My daughter called me last week to tell me she'd been to a farmer's market in Tempe and found a vendor selling the same kind of ceramic mixing bowls that Carol used to use. She bought one. She sent me a photo of it on her kitchen counter. It was the right shade of blue and the same wide flat rim, and I had to sit down when I saw it. She said, "I think Mom would have liked this place." I said, "She would have talked to every single vendor." She laughed. The whole face laugh. I hadn't heard it in a long time, and it had been so long that I'd started to wonder whether I was remembering it right. I wasn't. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot lately, not in any grand philosophical way. Just the plain mechanical version of it, the version I understood as an inspector. Every crack in a structure has an origin point. Every failure has a sequence. Nothing collapses without warning signs that were present long before the collapse. You either read them or you don't. What Bryce built in that house in Gilbert didn't happen overnight. It happened in increments so small that my daughter couldn't feel the temperature dropping. A shorter call here, a canceled visit there, a list of rules on a laptop screen that she had absorbed so completely she'd stopped questioning whether they were reasonable. That's how this kind of thing works. It doesn't ask for your agreement once. It asks for it in pieces, over years, until compliance feels like personality. What I understand now that I didn't understand when Carol was alive is that the people who love us are also the people we are most likely to rationalize for. My daughter is not a naive person. She's sharp and perceptive and funny, and she had built a whole professional life on her own terms before she ever met Bryce. But love, the real kind, the kind that wants to preserve something, will talk a person into swallowing a great deal before it admits what's happening. I did it too, in a different way. I told myself she was busy. I told myself I was giving her space. I was giving Bryce room is what I was doing. And I called it respect. The thing that saved us, if I'm being honest, was not the lawyer and not the accountant, though both were necessary. What saved us was that I kept showing up. I kept calling. I kept arriving with pastries and sitting at that kitchen table and talking about tomato plants and office gossip and Carol's mixing bowls and the terrible joke about the backwards drainage pipe. I was there, consistently, in a way that couldn't be managed entirely out of her life, and when the moment came when she needed to hand that laptop over to someone who would read what was on the screen and not look away, I was still close enough to be that person. That's what I'd tell anyone watching this who is sitting somewhere wondering whether they should say something. The answer is yes, not loudly. Not in a way that backs the person you love into a corner or gives the person controlling them an excuse to tighten the grip. But stay present, stay consistent. Be the person they can call. Because the one thing that coercive control cannot survive, long-term, is an outside relationship that simply refuses to disappear. You don't have to win an argument. You just have to still be there. Document your money. Write it down. The amount. The purpose. The date. Whether it's a gift or a loan. Not because the people you give it to are untrustworthy. Because the documentation protects the relationship itself if circumstances change, and circumstances can always change. I gave $45,000 with no paperwork because it didn't occur to me that I'd ever need it. Wendell's files and that letter I'd forgotten I'd written were the only reasons we had any recourse at all. Don't make that mistake. A single page, signed and dated, is worth more than any amount of good faith when good faith turns out to be the only thing you brought to the table. My daughter put Carol's mixing bowl on her kitchen counter in Tempe. Blue, wide-rimmed, exactly right. She sent me a photo without being asked. That's the version of her I had been holding on to. The one who would think to do a thing like that. And for a long time I wasn't sure I was going to get her back. You do the right thing not because it guarantees the outcome you want. You do it because it's the only thing you can do and still live with yourself when you're sitting alone at a kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night trying to remember what your wife's voice sounded like. She sounded like she was right about everything most of the time. She usually was.